Right, in this video, I'm going to look at digital painting and just kind of a quick setup, not really getting into too much of actually painting anything specifically, but just set up an idea just to get started. Hopefully it will help us out. Number one, I'm going to start off with a new document, and I'm just going to quickly keep it simple. I'll even go 8.5 by 11 as per usual. 300 pixels per inch, let's assume it's for print, because if we started off for web and want to make it for print later, that's going to be an issue, right? So RGB to start, obviously, because we could change to CMYK later. RGB gives us more access to more things in Photoshop, and I'll just create. So here I am, and now let's set up our panels. So right now, obviously my layer panel, very important. I have a few here, property, history, just normal ones I normally have. History is always good to have. Properties give you a lot of options too, but what I want obviously is some brushes. We're gonna play around with some brushes. So let's open up a few panels that we're gonna need. So I'm gonna look at brushes, and here I have that. And what I could do with this is just take a look at a lot of the different brushes I have. You might not have as many, you might have more, depending on what you have. Adobe provides you with quite a few, and you can actually download even more online with them. A lot of these different brush packs, which are really, really great. So we have that. Then I'm going to go to my brush settings. It gives me just a little bit quicker to access some of my brush settings here. Okay, so I have that as well. When I actually start using my brush, I'll be able to play around with brush settings just a little bit quicker to access and have everything there for me, whatever I want to use. Then I'm also going to open up my color. I normally don't have my color panel open, but I'm going to keep it open just so I can access whatever I want to access there. And I might look at it a slightly different way. So here I'm going to have my drop down, and I'm going to go to the color wheel. So the color wheel, I like using this way because I like the hue, the saturation, and brightness. I actually prefer using it this way. This way I can actually dumb down these things a little bit quicker, as opposed to using the CMYK scale. That is good too, and you might want to work this way as well, but I just feel as, you know, using it as if this was my palette, I probably would want to use the color wheel a little bit more, because I feel I have a little bit more control the way I want to select my colors. You choose whichever way you want. So that's one. And then the other last, I'd like to look at my swatches. This way I could actually select swatches that I want to use and load them in here. But I'm going to show you a slightly different way to do that as well when you're working with your work, when you're working with what you want to work with. So I'm just going to create a little a sphere, and give it some depth and just paint. I'm not going to go too crazy. I just want to give you an idea of process, not really final piece, because I want you to experiment, play around, and have some fun with it. So what I would do first is obviously always, let's play with some layers. So I'm going to lock the first one, and I'm just going to play around with what I would normally do is a underlying paint, so some undercoating, as opposed to painting directly on white. Depending on what you're doing, what your project might be, it might be something totally different, but the idea of painting in general, I'm taking from an analog to digital. I'm actually going to give this, I'm going to double click here, color overlay. I'm just going to give it a slightly different hue. I'm not going to make it white. I don't like stark white, so I'll just give it a little bit of something else there, just to give it so a little bit of something, a little value. That way, when if I do add a white, like paint an actual white, you could see actual white. It's not the background, and it just gives me a different setting here, which is always nice. Okay, so what I'll do here, I'm going to start grouping myself, and so Command G, I select that. I'm going to make a group, and I'm just going to call it background, and I can do different things with the background as well. So I'm going to shrink that, and I'm going to make a new layer. And what I'm going to do on this layer, I'm just going to put a circle. The circle might just help me, give me a bit of reference to work with right here. And whether you know this or not, when you open up a shape, any type of shape layer, the properties opens up, and you could actually play around with the fill and the stroke, just like we can in Illustrator. So what I'll say is I don't want any stroke, so I just click on that, or any fill, click on that, and say no fill. And on the stroke, I'm going to say just give me a bit of a black stroke there, and maybe I can make it a couple pixels, doesn't matter, 2 pixels. Okay, enter, and there it is. Cool. And what I could do also, just so it doesn't kind of mess with me too much, I could also lower the opacity here and bring it down so it's just there, subtle enough, and that's fine. So what I'll do really quickly as well with that, I will go to my align to canvas and center, and just to give me some kind of reference there, which is totally fine. And what I'll do once again, I'll group that, Command G, and if you don't know that, you could just go to new group, and I want to group that. I'm just going to call this shape, just for now, or foundation or base or whatever you want. Next, what I'm going to do, let's actually start painting. Let's have some fun here. But I do want to set up myself first with potentially a palette. Now I could do it over here as well and set myself up with swatches and say, you know, this is for this particular project. But what I'll do instead is I'll just make some squares here on my board, and I'll just create a color palette that I might use. And I'm just going to super simplify. That's all I'm going to do today is go medium, highlight, shadow, and then maybe do some overlays of warm and cool, just very subtle things that you might want to play around with. But once again, you know, you got to know your color theory just to play around, just have some decent ideas. So we'll do that. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go with some browns. I don't know why, I just wanted to use some browns. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to find a mid color I want to go with, which is right here. That's kind of fine. I like that. And I'll say okay to that. And what I'll do is I could even add it here. And I'll say, yeah, that's fine, swatch, whatever, or just call it, you know, mid-brown if I want to. Okay, and there it is, it shows up there. And I don't want to add it to my libraries, that takes a little longer. I want to make this that color, so I could choose this, or choose it from here, and now I have that one there. I'm going to duplicate this, hold on Option and Shift, and bring it next. Next, what I'll do, maybe I'll find that highlight I want, so I'll just go up here and bring myself to a highlight. I can see right there where it's going to be. I could use this, or I could use my sliders, and maybe that's my highlight there. Okay. I don't want to go white. I could always add in details later, so let's just go with a lighter version of this color, and I'll say okay. I'll add it, and I'll just go light brown. Okay, still can't spell it. Okay, and once again, I will just say, I'll double click here, say yes, I want to change that color to this color, or because it changed here in the foreground color there. Okay, done. And I'll do one more. So now I do got to be careful because the background color here, it's getting a little too close to this, so I might have to be careful how I work with that. Either way, I could change it later, not a big deal. So this one, like I said, I'll make this now the darker version, and let's just say it'll be there. Cool. So I'm once again just going to add it. And this time I got smart. I'm not going to add it to my current library. That's my Adobe CC libraries. Takes a little bit longer sometimes. And now this is my dark brown. Or we could even say the shadow or whatever. And we can always go darker later on, whatever we want to do. It's just a starting point. So I'm going to double click here. Once again, it adds it there. Or I could have clicked on it here. So I have my special colors there for this particular job. So once I'll do, I'll hold down Shift, select them all. I'm going to group them, Command G. And now I'm going to just label them as, like, say, that's my palette. Because as you got to think, as an analog painter, you have a palette, you have paintbrushes, you have a canvas, you have certain materials in front of you that are going to help you, you know, create whatever you want to create. So it's great to organize ourselves in this way too. You know, unlike analog, we can undo, we can do these different things like we can analog. But this is obviously a way to play around and have some fun with it too. So now I'm going to start painting. So what I'll do, I do need to start figuring out, okay, what kind of brushes do I want to use? And, you know, maybe I could have them in my general brushes. I'm actually able to select certain brushes and say, you know what, I like this brush here. I could bring it up and say, okay, this is a brush I'm going to use often. And I can play around with it now in my brush settings. Once I select it, I can actually go to my brush settings and do a lot of different things with my brush, but I don't want to. I want to keep it as is. So that's what I'll do. So I can make a new brush group by right-clicking. I believe I can bring it up and save it as a brush I'm going to use often, click and drag, and now it's here as a brush I want to use. I actually might not use this brush. I might actually try it out to have some fun. Either way, here I am. I've got this brush selected. I'm going to, right now it says I can't use it. Okay, why is that? Well, I'm on a grouped layer. There's nothing really there. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a new layer. And there it is. There's nothing on that layer. And now I can use my brush. Okay, so just in case your brush isn't working, you have to have a empty layer or some kind of layer selected where I'm actually able to paint on it. So there I am. So now let's look at a few brush tips. Or tricks, I should say, not tips, because brushes actually have tips. So what I can do with my keyboard shortcuts, I can use my open bracket or close bracket. Open bracket makes my brush smaller. close bracket makes my brush bigger, okay? So usually when we're painting, we can start big and then go small. But if you just want to stay small all the time and just paint in a detailed style way, you can. It's entirely up to you how you choose to paint. And that's the great thing about painting and digital painting. You have so many more things available to you. You don't have to run to the art store to get certain paint or a certain paintbrush. Everything's right here for you, and a lot of it. So you might really want to control the things you have in front of you. Maybe you don't need the swatches. Maybe you don't need this. Maybe you don't need brush settings for it in front of you. Maybe you don't need all these brushes. There's ways to control your workflow that you might find very, very useful. Either way, this is just a start. So I'm going to start a little bit big. I'm going to make sure that I have my this mid color selected first. So the keyboard shortcut for the eyedropper is I. So I'm just going to pick I, or I could click on the eyedropper, and I'm going to click my palette, select that paint color if you will, and now I have it selected. It's ready to go, and I'm going to go back to, let's see what brush is. Brush is B, so I'm going to click B. So I and B, you might be going back and forth between just to select and brush, select and brush, select and brush. So let me start with that. So what I'll do, I'm just going to go here. Okay, that's a little too thick right away. I'm thinking, okay, not a problem. Let me undo those. Command Z, Command Z, Command Z, or I can go on my history panel, go back, get up to my new layer, or get rid of my brush where I did that. Let's take a look now at the opacity and the flow. There's a few things we could do here. Okay, so my opacity is at 100%. That means if I paint, I'll paint and it'll be 100% of that color. Let me undo that. Now let's pretend I go to 50% and I paint 50% of that color. Okay, and then if I go over it again, now I'm getting more and more and more, and that'll eventually build up to 100%. You might like to paint this way. You might want to start off slow and build and build. Like paint can be, like it's almost like watered down. So that's one way to do it, and that's the way I'm going to play around with it now. There's many different ways to do it. The flow. So I have my flow right now, and that's how my flow comes out great at 15%. If I go 100%, let's see what the flow looks like. It gets a little bit more, like it's almost more paint is coming out as opposed to less paint coming out. Let's go to about 5%, see what happens there. All right, so you see the difference. Less paint comes out. So not only have less of the opacity of the paint, like it's watered down more, but less paint is coming out in terms of its flow. So those are different things. So let's play around. I actually don't mind what this has done right now. I kind of like that, and experimenting with it will definitely help out. So I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. I'm just going to start painting around the circle. And every time I let go of a click, it's like reapplying paint. Okay? I'm just painting, using that as my guide. It doesn't matter. We're just playing around right now. I'm making mistakes, and that's not a problem. Now, my computer is going a little bit slower. It is lagging, number one, because I'm recording a video. And number two, digital painting does require a little bit more RAM because you're going to be applying these things, and it needs to catch up and understand the paint you're using and the flow you're using and all these different things. So it's good to start off small, 8.5 by 11. I am at 300 pixels per inch, so that's another issue too. But all in all, it shouldn't be too bad. So I'm just going to keep painting, kind of fill that in. And I got a little bit of the background in there, which I love to do as well. So now let's go a little darker. Let's go to the dark and see how this goes. I'm going to click on, actually, if I click on Option, it goes to my last tool. I'm going to click Eyedropper. As opposed to clicking on I and going that, I could actually now just click on Option, and it lets me select Eyedropper right away. So that's even easier than pressing I and then B and I and B. Hold down Option, and you could pick that as well. So I'm going to paint some more, but this time maybe I will shrink down my brush. And this time I'm going to go even lighter and just play around with adding a little bit of subtlety over here. Great. Don't want to add too much, just want to give it a little bit of dimension. Okay. I'm going to zoom out, Command minus. And now what I want to do too, realistically, I should have done, is I'm going to add some background here, just so I have some something that it's grounded on, which is important too. So let me actually just use this color for now. I'm just going to shrink this down and go like this. Okay, I give myself a little bit of a line, so I'm going to separate myself between here and there. I'm going to get this a little bit bigger and just brush in what would be considered a background. And you can see it's lagging. That's okay. Not a big deal. It'll get there eventually. Now, if you're doing some details and some fine drawing, you definitely don't want that. So you're definitely going to want to clean that up, or shut things down that you don't need open, just so you could play a little bit better. So I'm just playing around, just seeing what different things do. Maybe I could play with my flow differently, change the opacity up. It doesn't matter, we're just playing around. And then this top I'll leave as is. I'm fine with that for now. But the problem is, now that I've colored over my palette has changed. So maybe what I should do is click on top and bring it back up top, so that way my palette, it does not get changed because I've painted over top of it. Now another thing I might want to do is actually play around with the different layers I have. So what I could have done, instead of painting the dark on top on one layer, I could have put the dark part on another layer. So let me do it this way. I'm going to make a new layer, and this time I'm going to put my highlights on this layer. So I'm going to hold down Option, click, and now I'm going to add in my highlights here a little bit. Okay, I'm just going to slowly bring those in, not too much, just a little bit. Great. I can go back to this one. I'm going to click back on my palette, and just to kind of bring back in some of those colors, which are going very, very slowly, and we'll see how that goes eventually if it does come back in. Oh, I see, because it's 100%, those colors are there. So what I could do too now is, I was painting, but it's not allowing, it's coming in a little bit. There we go. I was going to say that this potential, there is not an opacity on this, but I can bring down the opacity if I want. And say, oh, you know what, I painted too much. Maybe I should bring it down a little bit. So you can always play with that too. And I'm going to show you another option in just a second as well. So I'm back on my highlight, and I can even label these layers properly too. So let me call this, and this was mid and dark. This one is just highlights. You could really play around with all these things. Maybe I should have made a mid, maybe I should have made a shadow or a dark, and then maybe I should have made it high. So my highlights, or my lights, whatever I want to call it. And I'll just group these ones as well and just call this the actual paint. These are the things I'm actually painting. So I'm just going to keep on playing around, adding some colors. And because I got low, I'm building and building and building, like I might potentially do on my an actual painting. So now this one I might want to bring up a little bit, 50%, or sorry, 50%. And paint in maybe like a shadow. If there was some light source, a proper light source. And here I'd have to build more and more and more, because this should potentially be the darkest spot of my drawing here, of the cast shadow. I'm going to bring it up even more, and maybe what I'll do is bring up my flow as well. Just try it out, just to see what it does, because who knows, who cares, we're just playing around. I see what's happening here. It flows a lot better. And look what it's also happening. I'm getting a bit more of a harder edge, which is totally fine. Because you know what? I wish this brush had a little bit more of a softer edge. And that's okay. I can go down here and I could play around with that. So the wet edges, the buildup, the smoothing, shape dynamics. So I could play around with those. I could also play around with the, well, this one I can't play around with the hardness or softness. I could play around with the spacing, but I don't really want that. So some brushes you cannot touch the softness or hardness. You can play around with the roundness, but some you can play around with the hardness of it. So let me click this new brush, soft round. So there's spacing as well, but I don't want that. But look at the hardness. I can make it very hard edge, or I can make it very soft, or in between. So I'm still going to continue with my soft edge, but now maybe I just want to play around a little bit more with this softer. Okay, that's building something nice there too. Maybe I got to come back to this and bring back in. Maybe I'm going to play around, go back to 25%, and maybe just 10% here, and bring back some of this color, just a little bit there. Come back to shadow, bring back a little bit more here. Great. Okay. Now, obviously, I made some mistakes here, didn't I? This is supposed to be my highlight layer, and I've painted on top of it of different tones. I should have kept it on mid-dark. So that's something you got to keep in mind as well. But all in all, it's not a horrible thing, really. Okay, we could obviously play around with that. That's not the worst thing. Once again, number one, we're playing around, and number two, the painting right now currently looks okay, so I'm not too concerned with that. Shutting off the shape now, as I don't really need it anymore. I'm just playing around, having some fun. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to bring this one out and see what this does. Yeah, because my background is a little too light and this is not light enough, it's hard. So I will just paint some more on the highlights. Okay. let's pretend we're happy with this. It's totally fine, looking good, not a problem. Now what I want to do is I want to bring out my warms and cools, okay? So instead of getting my paint and adding in some red or some warmer tones, or the opposite, I want to get some cool and draw things away from the eye. Maybe what I could do here instead is add a new layer and brush on some straightforward blue. And I'm going to show you a little technique you might want to use that might benefit you with this. So let's pretend you actually really are very happy with your overall technique here and what's going on. And you just want to add some subtle hints of blue, or sorry, cool colors and warm colors to really draw the eye. So let me play around with that. So number one, what I'll do, I'll go back to my palette and I'll grab another one, make another one here. And this time I'm going to go to a bit more of the cool side here. So I'm going to go to maybe more of a bluish tone, and I'll try to find a blue that is a little bit more gray, not just super blue, like too much, too saturated, just a little blue that could, you know, roughly match or come in terms of this, the tone that I'm looking for. But it doesn't really matter because the way we're going to play with it might change anyways. So I'm happy with that. I'm just going to add it. And there I go. I'm just going to call this my cool tone. And there I go. And now what I can do is just select it. Okay. And, oh, sorry. I'm going to double click there. And now I can select it here. And there's my cool tone. So now what I'm going to do with this selected on my new layer, and I'm going to call this the cool layer, I'm going to select my brush and I'm just going to start painting. And you know, I'm going to go back to that brush I had before. It was a really nice brush to play with. And I'm just going to, once again, okay, 100% opacity, no, let's go back to 25. Flow, let's go to 5. Just playing around. And so everything that recedes or pulls away from the eye, I'm going to see that this kind of pulls away from the eye. Those edges pull away from the eye. Okay, cool. Not great. My technique is not fantastic, that's for sure, and that's okay. So what I could do here now is a couple things. I could say, well, that's too much. I could go back and undo it, change the blue, and try to figure out a blue I really like. Or I could play with the opacity because it's on its own layer. I could bring that down, and well, that's kind of interesting. That's very nice. Now at its fullness there, at 100% opacity, there's another thing I could do is play around with my blending modes. Right now, all my blending modes are normal. I can start to scroll down and see what happens, and there's certain ones that work really well. That one looks very nice, where when this actually comes in, let me leave it there for a second, when they actually start to blend, the colors actually change, and they blend better, they blend well. This blue stays on top because it's on the lighter, this on the darker, so now they start to blend. You might want to use that. Multiply does something a little bit different too. All right, so we're just playing around, we're just going around and seeing which ones might work better for us. Maybe we are looking for a different technique, and that's fine. But I found that overlay or soft light are kind of interesting too, that can really help us play around. Now, some of these obviously some interesting effects, but we're not looking for that. I'm looking for that subtlety that comes with overlay. And what I could do, I was like, you know what, it's not enough. Do I paint more? Or maybe I could just duplicate this layer, Command J, and now I just slowly add more and more and more and more and more if I want. I can always add more layers, and I could merge them together if I want. I could change the opacity. Either way, I'm just going to Command Z and undo those. To duplicate a layer, many different ways to do it. You can just right-click, duplicate layer, just down here, duplicate layer. Command J is the keyboard shortcut for duplicate layer. Hold down Option and click and drag, duplicate layer. So many different ways to duplicate layers. So on this one, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to keep on brushing a little bit more. Now that it is set to overlay, watch what happens when I brush. Very subtle hints of what I'm doing. And even here, when it doesn't go that bluish, it kind of blends in with the colors below, which is beautiful. And I get more of a purplish as opposed to a blue. That's great. So now let's do the opposite. And let's actually fill this, get this maybe a little bit more blue too. Okay. And if I want to be even more specific, I could say, you know what? I want this cast shadow blue to be on another layer so I can play with it in a different way too. But once again, always think about something else. Masks. We say, you know what? I've done too much blue here. I'm not happy with it, and it's just not working. It's like, you know what? I went too much. Okay, not a problem. Let's click on a mask. So now I have a layer mask here. And remember, if I paint white, it shows. If I paint black, it hides. So I'm going to paint black on the layer. Make sure I'm on the mask and not the layer. If I'm on the mask here, I'm just going to paint blue, whatever. If I'm on the actual mask, I'm going to paint black. And what I could do, my opacity is 25%, I could slowly start taking some of that away. See that? So I could always have even more control over how I want this to look. Either way, that's another one. The next thing we're going to do is I'm going to add in warmness. I'm going to bring some warmth to it now. Okay, so let's pick another color. Let's go to our reds. And maybe because this is already kind of orangey, yellowish, a little browny, let me maybe bring that up and try to find a little bit more there. Try to find there. Maybe a little bit more here. You play around, have fun. You obviously can see all the different changes you can make. It doesn't matter which one you choose. Try to get close, but there's always ways to play with it. I'm going to add it in here, and I'm just going to say this is my warm. Okay, and now I'm going to call this warm. This is my warm layer. Great. I'm going to now choose my brush, and I want it to be warm, which it is right there. Oh, what I should have done as well, my apologies, is make a new swatch and double click there and select here, and there it is. Okay, now I have it ready to go. And back to my brush, and now I'm on the wrong one. There's my layer, and I'm just going to start painting. There we go. Just in this area, general area, not a big deal. Doesn't look great, a little too much. Okay, there we go. Just to kiss it just a little bit, just to have a little hint that this part is what's standing out closest to me, to the eye. Okay, and then once again, it's a little too much. That's okay. We know we could play with this. We could add a mask. We could change the opacity. We could change the blending mode. Okay, now overlay is almost a little too much there. So let me go soft light. It breaks it down just a little bit more, makes it a little bit more subtle. So now that it's soft light, and maybe I bring down the opacity a little bit, I can play around with it more and still paint, but it's very subtle painting. Okay, and now look at how all these colors start to come together, the underlying layers and the new ones I'm painting, and really creating an interesting painterly process that I potentially like. Now this is one style of painting. There are many different ways to paint. So hopefully this gives you an understanding of how to stay organized in your layers, how to use your brushes and select certain ones, and if you have a certain one that you really like, you want to play around with, you might want to do. We can even look at brushes that have more texture to them, but there are so many different brushes that you can play around with and use, but realistically, try to stick to ones you generally like. Don't go overboard, and really keep it simple for yourself. Now, if I play around with something a little bit more interesting here, right now my screen resolution is pretty high, so my screen is actually smaller to play around with. If I wanted to, I could maybe start adding some textures in a certain way, and just start painting. I'm gonna go really big here for now, just to see what it does. A little too much. Let me go back to an actual certain color here. There we go. And I'm gonna, oh, it automatically, so you gotta keep in mind there, anytime you pick a new brush, it's probably gonna reset its preferences. So I'm probably gonna go 25% here, and once again, my flow, I'll just go 50, and maybe I'll brush a little bit, see what that does. And I could always bring down the, once again, the opacity, add a mask, or change the blending mode. Playing around with brushes, playing around with the individual settings of certain brushes. Some things you cannot change, as we've seen, but the majority of things you can change on your brushes. You can choose your brushes here as well. There's brush options here, just like there's brush options here. So brush settings versus brushes. Using your color panel. You could use a lot of options here and different ways you might want to see your color panel. You might want to use it this way. You might want to use this way, whatever you're comfortable with. Like I said, I'm a big fan of the color wheel. Other people might choose a different way. Having your swatches open. Maybe you already have a certain group of swatches you really like and want to keep them. Maybe you want to get rid of some of these. They're a little too much to see. So there's a lot of options here. So I'm just organizing myself in a certain way that you might find useful. But keep in mind, once you lay anything down, you have the ability to make a new layer. So even once again, we're talking about non-destructive ways to do something. I can change this in a multiple of ways. Change the blending mode. Done. Change the opacity if I want. Done. Change, add a mask and paint on the mask and remove some things if I want. Done. Okay. So a lot of options. Playing around with the opacity, playing around with the flow, smoothing if you want to actually add some airbrush techniques. So a lot of different things you could do here. to play around, have some fun, digital painting. Now, I'm using a mouse and a keyboard. Those of you who have tablets, you're obviously going to get a lot more out of it using a stylus. Having pressure sensitivity will take your digital painting game to a whole new level. You're going to be more or less feel like painting with a real brush because of how hard you go or how light you go. With a mouse, obviously, you cannot do that. So hopefully you play around, have some fun, and see where digital painting takes you.